Hello, everybody. My name is Gabriela Becerra-Zilig, UX designer from São Paulo, one of the organizers of this year, South UX, and a volunteer at the Ladies That UX. For accessibility, I'm going to say what you guys are seeing. My skin is white, bluish eyes, my hair is a dark shade of blonde, straight and medium length. I'm wearing a black t-shirt with some white graphics and a gray headphone. In my background, there is two small half moons hanging on a purple wall. The lecture that you're going to see now is Tips for Better Unmoderated User Tests. Unmoderated user tests are tests users undertake without your supervision or a researcher, like magic. Okay, not quite, but they are a really powerful tool to have in your research toolbox. Moderated user testing offers many benefits, but it is not without its pitfalls. This presentation offers practical tips to avoid these pitfalls and get the most from your unmoderated user tests. Our dear speaker is now from Dublin, Ireland. She's a senior UX researcher with a background in engineer and product management, spanning more than 20 years. She enjoys collaborating with product teams to develop research-based, user-centered solutions. She's always seeking to innovate, improve her UX research process to best meet the needs of her team and ultimately her users. She holds a Bachelor of Engineering, Master of Science in Engineering, and Post-Graduate Diploma in Digital Media Production. She works at Udemy Dublin and mentors with Ladies That UX Dublin. Welcome, Mary. Glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. It's lovely to be here. Hello to everybody and greetings from my kitchen here in Dublin, Ireland. It's lovely to be here. So I think I should be describing myself too for accessibility purposes. So I'm standing against a white wall. I have shoulder length, light brown hair and blue-gray eyes. And today I'm wearing a big blue scarf around my neck. I'm very pale and pasty. Yeah, that's me. Shall I kick off, Gabrielle?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to leave you guys here with just Mary and her presentation. Goodbye, guys.
Thank you. Hi, everybody again. So today, as I mentioned, as Gabrielle introduced me, my name is Mary Nolan, and I am a senior UX researcher at Udemy here in Dublin, where I specialize in researching our business product, Udemy for Business. I also participate in Ladies That UX Dublin, and I'm very grateful for all the work that the Ladies That UX Dublin volunteers do to make those events happen. Today, I want to share with you some tips and tricks that I've learned to improve my unmoderated user testing technique. These are lessons I've learned from, well, the hard way, I guess, from making mistakes and figuring out how to fix those mistakes along the way. But before we jump into the details of those tips and tricks, I want us all to gain a common understanding of what it is exactly I mean by unmoderated user testing and the pros and cons of unmoderated user testing. For those of you who don't already use unmoderated user testing in your research practice, I'm hoping that this talk will inspire you to investigate and explore the potential that unmoderated user testing might have for you. For those of you that are experienced in unmoderated user testing, I hope that you'll find some useful tips to help improve your unmoderated user testing technique. So let's jump in and explore what we're going to cover today, just recap on that. So I want us to understand what it is we mean by unmoderated user testing. Once we've established a common understanding of unmoderated user testing, which I'm going to call unmod testing for short for the rest of this presentation, we're going to take a quick look at the pros and cons of unmod testing. Unmod testing is a really powerful tool, but it does have its pitfalls, its weaknesses, and I want us to be clear about those before you choose it as a technique for any particular project. And then we'll get into the fun stuff, the tips and tricks that I've learned over the years to building better unmoderated user testing. So let's cover the basics. What exactly is unmoderated user testing? Well, it kind of does what it sounds like. It's testing that takes place without you, the researcher, in the same space as the participant. The participant typically follows tasks you've set them in a test script through usually an online user testing tool. And they may also answer some preset follow-up questions to their tests. Now, the tools, the users that can participate in these unmoderated user tests can be anybody. They could be your co-workers, they could be your customers, or they could be participants recruited from a third-party participant recruitment tool or through your moderated or unmoderated testing tool. So let's take a look now at some of the benefits of unmoderated user testing. Why would you want to try unmod testing? One of the most significant benefits of unmod testing is speed. They are super quick, especially when you compare it to moderated user testing. That's where you are live with the participant, and even quicker than laboratory user testing or field studies. So there's a couple of reasons why it's so quick. The first is that the tests can run in parallel. So several participants can be taking your test at the same time, which means that you could potentially launch a test and have results within an hour or so. The other huge advantage that speeds up unmoderated user testing compared to other forms of testing is the low research ops overhead. That is the scheduling, the coordinating of calendars, and all the other extra work that goes into scheduling live research. So you save on that because the participants take your test in their own time and in their location, so you do not have to worry about those scheduling overheads. Another advantage of the fact that participants take your test in their own time and in their own location is that you have access to a much wider range of participants. You are not constrained by time zone, you are not constrained by geography, therefore you can reach a vastly wider range of potential participants for your tests. Another very particular and current benefit of unmod testing is that because you never share the space with the participant, nor they with you, it's pretty much as safe as it can be when it comes to COVID-19 and social distancing. It's the ultimate social distancing method of testing. Other benefits of unmoderated user testing are that it is quite economical. It's quite low cost. Now, I put an asterisk there because you can actually end up with quite a significant outlay to secure a good user testing tool. But the per test cost is very low. And even there are ways around using a bespoke user testing tool. I've seen descriptions of doing unmoderated user testing with readily available tools like Zoom. There's a little more overhead involved in that, and that's the trade-off. But potentially it is very low cost method of testing. Another slightly funny benefit is candid responses. participants are not in the same room as you, and therefore they're less likely to feel afraid of hurting your feelings, which can be a disadvantage of in-person testing. And I've had some responses from participants in Unmod tests that have been very candid. So that is an interesting, if perhaps somewhat unexpected benefit. Another benefit is the availability of quantitative metrics. Now, I put an asterisk on this one too. So many user testing tools allow you to measure quantitative metrics like time on task or success factors. The potential disadvantage of that is that they're not super reliable. If you have a participant who gives very full descriptions of what they're doing and what they're seeing, which is excellent, that's what you want an Unmod tester to do, it can skew the time on task, the measurement of the time on task. It may seem longer than it actually took the participant to do the task because they spent a lot of the time describing, which isn't what they would do in real life. So take the quantitative metrics with a grain of salt. That said, over a range of tests, you can still establish some useful benchmarks and estimates of time on task, which can be a helpful success metric. So these are the benefits of Unmod testing. These are among the benefits of Unmod testing, but there are pitfalls that you should be aware of before you proceed to opt to undertake Unmod testing. So let's explore some of the risks and pitfalls of unmoderated user testing. Some of these are self-explanatory. If your participant is going to test your product or your prototype alone, then your product or prototype needs to be of sufficient high fidelity for them to be able to work through the tasks without your help. In other words, the product needs to be usable in a standalone state. If you're testing a prototype where everything doesn't work as fully as a full product would, it's a good idea to set your participants expectations about how the product will work, that some things may not work exactly as they would expect it because it's a prototype. Another self-explanatory risk or pitfall of Unmod testing is that if the participant does something really interesting or strange or just downright weird, and you are really keen to ask them why, obviously you can't, because you're not interacting with the participant in real time. You can't ask them questions. You can't probe why it is they undertook a task in the way that they did, or ask them to explain further responses that they have given. So that you need to bear those disadvantages in mind when you're choosing unmoderated user testing. There are a couple of other risks of Unmod testing which I should mention. There is always the risk that your participant will click on a link you did not expect them to, or take a turn in your product, in your task that you definitely did not expect. And a potential consequence of that is, the best case, I guess, is that task will be a bit meaningless to them if they find themselves somewhere you didn't expect and the task is written for where you did expect them to be. The more serious risk is that if the participant gets lost in an early task in your test, that the whole rest of the test is rendered meaningless because the rest of your tasks assume that they are somewhere other than where they actually are in your product. Another slightly related risk is misinterpretation. So you may write your task meaning one thing, and the participant reads your task and thinks you mean something completely different. And you didn't even realize that your task was open to interpretation. So You need to bear those pitfalls in mind before you embark on unmoderated user testing. And many of the tips that I'm going to share with you shortly are aimed at addressing some of these pitfalls. So let's jump in and have a look at some tips for better unmoderated user testing. So the first one, very simple. These are very practically oriented tips. These are tips that you can take away and actually apply the next time you're using unmoderated testing, or even if you're trying unmod testing for the first time. So let's jump in. My first tip, you're starting out designing a test. I would strongly recommend that you draft your test in docs, like Google Docs or Word, or basically not in your user testing tool. And there's a number of reasons why this is important. Firstly, it's definitely easier to edit your test and refine it in a document than in your user testing tool. It's easier to share your document for feedback from stakeholders before you start building your test in your tool. Another advantage is that you can add more details, such as where you want the participant to be at the start of a task, what the success metric of that task is, and the goal of that task. We'll get back to that in a minute. And a bonus tip here, if you are, when you are writing your script, do include a screenshot of the product or prototype that you are testing. And the reason I recommend this, you can always go back and look at the videos of the test to identify what product it is that is being tested. But there's a little bit of overhead to that. It takes a bit of time and it's a bit of trouble. So it is much easier, much quicker, just to include a screenshot of the key defining area of the product that you are testing, so that if the product evolves, for instance, if you change the design based on the findings of your unmod test, you'll be clear about which exact version of your product was being tested in these tests. So then we get into the actual tasks themselves. So your test is typically made up of multiple tasks. And I draft my tasks in this way. I use this template. There's 4 ingredients to a task. The first is the starting URL. Where in the product do you need the participant to be at the start of each task? Do you remember I said that the participants can get lost in a task by clicking an unexpected link? This is how you mitigate that. So define where it is the participant needs to be at the start of each task. Then I like to define the goal of the task. So each task is asking a question about your product. So in this example, I ask, it tests if the user can find a particular course. So the goal helps you keep focused. If you keep focused, then you'll keep your script focused on your goal and keep your test script with your research goals in mind. Then the test script itself. This is the text that the participant will actually see. This is the bit the participant will see. And we're going to go into that in a little more detail in a moment. And then finally, success. It's very helpful to define what it is you define as success for this task. What is it that the user has to do to qualify this task as a success? Doing this really helps in speeding up your analysis, because you're absolutely clear about what it is you're defining as success. So let's take a closer look at that third ingredient, the task script. So another tip around writing tasks is to keep tasks short and simple. The part that you show the participant, the text that your participant sees, should be as short as possible to convey the information that they need to know to carry out the task. So in here, I have a look at the anatomy of a task. In this case, we have a context setting piece, a sentence. This is the homepage of an online learning website. And literally that is all you need to tell your participant to set the context. But you give that its own line. Then on a separate line, you set the participant the task. And in this case, the task is find the course Python for Beginners. So the task is very short, very concise, and in English anyway, put the verb first. And by this, I mean, make sure you tell the participant as early as possible what it is you want them to do. So you don't add pleases or thank yous or would you. Just put the actual task as succinctly as possible, as briefly as possible. And finally, avoid compound tasks. That's asking the participant to do one thing and then another. So in this case, I could have said, find the course Python for Beginners and enroll in it. But what I found in unmoderated user tests is that more often than not, the participant will complete the first part of the task, but will simply forget or overlook the second part of the task. So keep tasks short and simple. So here's a task. This is about one where you can all get involved and have a go. Here's a task that I think could definitely be improved. How would you improve this task based on the tips that I have shared? There's at least 3 changes I would make to this task. So if you want to have a go and if you're feeling brave, throw in some suggestions in the comments about how you would improve this task for an unmoderated user test. So I'm going to show you in a few seconds how I improved this task. So I may or may not have been watching the Great British Bake Off when I was writing this example task. Anyway, I'm going to show you how I improved this task. So here's the way I changed that task to make it more suitable for unmoderated user testing. Firstly, I stripped back the language of the context setting and gave the bare minimum of information that the participant requires to complete this task. So what was, and I'm just going to hop back to the task. Welcome to our home baking website where you can search for and find delicious recipes and handy tips. Became, this is a home baking website. Everything else is superfluous and is likely to distract the participant. Then I gave, on a separate line, the task I wanted the participant to do. And instead of, today we would like you to find a recipe called malted tea loaf and download that recipe, I've stripped that back to find, verb first, find a recipe called malted tea loaf. Now note, I dropped the task and download the recipe. And the reason being, as I mentioned earlier, that more often than not, the participant will read the first part and complete the first part of the task and overlook or forget the second part of the task. So if this was an unmoderated user test, the next task would be download the recipe malted tea loaf. Okay. So what we've been talking about is removing distractions, unnecessary language, to words that are not key to the task. But there are other ways that you can throw your participant and maybe give them unintended clues. If you read this, the writing in this purple bubble, it's kind of weird that we can actually read that and understand it. And most people can. And the reason is that we tend to scan rather than read words letter by letter. And our participants are no different. They will scan the text of your tasks. And you need to bear this in mind when you're writing your tasks and choosing the actual words that go into the task. So you've kept it short and sweet, you've kept it separate lines for separate information, you've put it verb first, but you also need to be aware of priming the participant unintentionally. Now, the obvious way of doing that is by using words that are actually already in your user interface. So for instance, imagine you want to set a participant a task to find something on your website, and your website has the word find, like a big find button. You need to be careful not to use the word find in your task. Instead, you might use the word search for. Similarly, you can even throw your participants with similar shaped and similar meaning words. So an example that I came across earlier this year when I was running unmoderated user tests with an interface that had the word contributor in the user interface. I said, well, I'm not going to use the word contributor. What's a word that's kind of like contributor, but isn't contributor? So I chose to use the word collaborator in one of my sets of tests. I actually ran several sets of tests, and I used different words in each of the tests. In one, it was editor, and the other author, and the other collaborator. And it was in the test set that used the word collaborator that had the highest success rate for that particular task. And I hypothesized that actually the participants taking the tests, were given an unintended clue when they saw the word collaborator, and they equated it with contributor. It just looks so similar in length and shape and meaning. There are other ways that you can give unintended clues to your participants as well. If you're using a prototype, the actual build of the prototype can sometimes leave little clues that you didn't intend. For instance, in some settings in prototype tools, when you click on a clickable area, all clickable areas will highlight with a big blue highlight square around the clickable areas. So suddenly the participant realizes where all of the areas that are clickable in your prototype are. And that's obviously not ideal and is likely to skew your results. So do be sure when you're using prototypes to switch off anything that might give the participant unintended clues. There's a lot of pitfalls around using prototypes in unmoderated testing, but that's a whole other conversation, as they say. So we mentioned earlier that there is always a risk that a participant can get lost in your test. And one of the ways to mitigate that risk is the use of the starting URL, which I mentioned when I was talking about the design, the template of a task. And there are pros and cons to using the starting URL. I would definitely fall in favor of using it, but you need to understand that it's not a perfect mitigation. So if there is a risk that your participant may get lost in the earlier tasks in your test, I would recommend that you define the starting URL, the starting location for every task. The advantage of that is you know for certain where your participant is going to be at the start of that task. So whatever they may have done in the previous task, they're starting off in the right place, and the task at least will be meaningful to them, or at least will make sense to them. The disadvantage is that it disrupts the natural flow of the test. So if your tasks are logical steps in a natural user flow, by disrupting each step with reloading a page, especially if the page was somewhere that the participant was on in the end of the previous task, it can look a little bit strange to the participant. They get a little message saying, please wait while a new page loads, and what opens is the page they were on before, and they're like, oh, was that the new page? And they can be momentarily thrown. Usually it does not confuse participants sufficiently to throw them off the task, but it is something to bear in mind. It disrupts the flow. But on balance, I think you're better off defining the starting URL rather than depending on the participant being in the right place at the start of your task. So you've got a lovely test. It's beautifully written. You've got short, succinct tasks. You've got starting URLs to find for every task. and now you're ready to launch your test. Wait. So if you have the time and resources, test your test. You're only human, and that's okay. You're going to make a mistake. There's going to be a blooper in there you didn't expect. This is where you flush out the link that doesn't work, the unintended flashing blue squares that give hints of where the clickable areas are, or the inadvertent use of a word that appears in your user interface in your task script. This is the time to flush out all those problems by getting a real participant to do your test from start to finish and to watch back the recording. It is very useful. Almost every time you do it, you'll find something that you went, I didn't spot that, no matter how carefully you edit your test and review your test. I would say this is especially important if you are using participants that are difficult to recruit. As a researcher on a B2B product, I know that it can be very challenging to connect with customers. So if I'm going to connect with a customer, I want to make sure that the tests that I'm running with them are as perfect as I can make them. So test your test. So, okay, now you've tested your test. You've got a beautifully written test. You've tested it. You've flushed out all those typos and links that didn't work and bloopers. Now you need to find some participants. Choosing your participants can be a bit of a minefield. As I mentioned earlier, your participants can be your co-workers, maybe a particular team in your organization. They can be your customers, or they can be participants recruited from a third-party recruitment service, either as part of your user testing tool or through a recruitment service, specialist recruitment service. You do need to understand who it is you need to recruit for your particular test. To do that, you need to understand what the goals of your test is and what the defining criteria of the real life user of the product that you're testing is. So you need to define your recruitment criteria. Now, you want them to be specific enough to truly represent your real life user, but not so specific that you'll never find enough participants that actually match those criteria. So you also, unfortunately, want to screen out cheaters, especially, this is true mainly of when you're using third-party recruitment. There are participants who will answer anything you want to hear to get their incentive for doing your test. So the way to screen for participants generally is to use screener questions. So ask questions that try to determine whether your participant matches your criteria or not. But one way to screen out cheaters is to avoid the use of yes, no questions in your screeners. So if you were asking about, if you wanted to do some unmoderated user testing on breakfast cereals and you wanted to speak to people who ate granola for breakfast, you wouldn't ask, do you eat granola for breakfast, yes or no? That would be too easy for a cheater to guess and say yes, regardless of what their tastes in granola were. Instead, you might ask, you would ask a multiple choice question where the topic of interest, where the responses are related and the topic of interest is a must select option. So it might go, which of the following breakfast cereals have you eaten in the last 3 months? Cornflakes, muesli, granola, porridge, and so on. And so it's not obvious to the participant what you're actually screening for. Another word of warning is the potential risk of professional testers. This is a weird problem. It sounds like on the outset, it's a weird problem. But the participants on many third-party participant recruitment platforms are very experienced testers. They are essentially like semi-professional testers. And that's absolutely fine. I mean, they actually do wonderful tests. They're great at talking out loud and articulating their thoughts and their impressions. But you need to ask yourself carefully, does a participant like that truly represent your real life users? And you need to consider, for instance, are your real life users that tech savvy? Are they are they likely to have be as digitally articulate as the semi-professional testers? It's not necessarily a bad thing. It may be absolutely fine, but just bear it in mind. And finally, for when you're thinking of your participants, if you are choosing participants who have no experience of unmoderated user testing, it can be really helpful to give them a little bit of guidance on what to expect and some pointers on how unmoderated testing takes place. I've actually lost unmod tests with inexperienced participants for really simple reasons, like they didn't realize that the task prompt could be moved, and the task prompt was actually obscuring a key part of the user interface for the test. So give novice unmod testers a little bit of an extra help, and so they know what it is that they're getting into and what to expect. That might be especially true if you're testing with coworkers or customers who've never done an unmoderated user test before. So that's let's recap on the pros and cons of unmod testing to wrap up, and the tips for building better tests. So the benefits. There are a lot of strengths to unmoderated user testing. It's quick. You don't have those research ops overheads to deal with. Your tests can run simultaneously. You have access to a much wider range of participants than if you were constrained by time zones or geography. For that same reason, it's also at this time a very safe form of testing because nobody is sharing the same space, neither the researchers nor participants. It can be a very low cost form of testing, but remember that there may be a significant outlay at the outset to secure a good user testing tools. But even then, there are ways around that. You can get some very candid responses when the participant is doing your tasks in their own environment and without the pressure of your presence. So you can get some very candid responses. And finally, you can get some useful quantitative metrics as well as qualitative. So you can get some useful quantitative metrics with the asterisk that the unmod testing environment can be a little artificial. So take those metrics with a grain of salt. So we know, of course, that there are pitfalls, and the way we mitigate those are with the tips. So let's recap finally on the tips for unmoderated testing. So draft your test in docs, not in the user testing tool, and in there define your starting URL, your goal and your task and your success. Keep it short. Keep your verb first, avoid compound tasks, one piece of information per line. Don't prime your users, watch out for leading languages, so that's language that appears in your UI, or clues like blue clickable areas. Don't lose your participants, that would be very sad. So consider using a starting URL at each task. Test your test, because you will make some mistakes, everybody does, and that's okay, but it is so much better to catch them before you share your test more widely. And then when you do go to share it more widely, choose your participants carefully. Specify the criteria that represent your users. Avoid the yes/no screener questions. Beware of the pro tester. That sounds wrong. The professional tester, and help novice users who've not had experience before so they know what to expect. So that is my presentation for today. I hope you found it useful, and if anybody has any questions, I'd love to take them now. Here's my details if you want to connect. Hi, everybody in the chats. I'll go back to the tips here. So there's the take-homes for today. I'm curious, is anybody... oh, I see a question coming in here. Gabrielle, do you want to share it on screen? Oh, yeah. Luana, hi. The tools I use to analyze methods and to analyze the data very old school. I tend to rely on a good old-fashioned spreadsheet. The way I tend to do it is to have my users on the rows of the spreadsheet and the tasks across the columns. And it helps both focus my viewing of the videos, of the recordings of the tests. And once I've documented or transcribed the findings of each task, I then analyze it by summarizing the columns. So I can view how every participant performed in each task. I tend to make a point of defining success, specifying the word success. It's very easy to read down how many successes and how many fails there were. I hope that answers your question. Anything else? I'm curious, have any of the viewers used unmoderated user testing, or particularly used it in an unusual way? I've seen some interesting applications of unmoderated user testing. Or indeed, is there anybody here who has not used unmoderated testing at all and is thinking about using it? Cool. Excellent. You're welcome, Donna.
So I think we're done here because soon we're going to start another lecture. So thank you so much, Mary, for being here with us today. I love it. I learned so much today.
My pleasure. I hope everybody learned something, and people want to connect. I'd love to hear people's tales of unmod testing and indeed research in general. So yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you. And thank you everyone for watching us. Stay tuned. The next lecture will be from Italy, Milan. Naomi, I don't know. I don't speak Italian. I'm so sorry about that. The theme is neurobranding, capire come funziona la nostra mente per migliorare la strategia. So thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you, Mary.
Bye.